There are places in Antarctica you are not allowed to go. Not discouraged, not difficult to reach, restricted. Coordinates that don't show up in travel routes, not near research stations, not near anything of obvious value, and yet multiple governments agree those areas should not be accessed. That fact alone might seem trivial or even bureaucratic, but once you start to examine the history, the policies, the scientific reasoning, and the geopolitical context surrounding the continent, it becomes clear that Antarctica is not merely a frozen wilderness. It is a landscape of extraordinary significance, a place where human curiosity collides with both extreme environmental hazards and a web of international oversight, where every decision about access reflects calculations about science, security, and the unknown. I wasn't searching for anomalies, conspiracies, or hidden truths when I first encountered this puzzle. My investigation began with a far more mundane goal: to understand the logistical complexities of Operation High Jump, the massive US military expedition to Antarctica in 1946. This was an operation designed not for espionage or secret discovery, but to study the practical challenges of operating in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Nearly 4,700 men, 13 ships, multiple aircraft, and mountains of supplies were mobilized for what, on the surface, seemed like an ordinary scientific and reconnaissance mission. Yet its scale, ambition, and abrupt termination would later raise questions that remain difficult to answer even decades later. Operation High Jump was led by Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, a man whose name is synonymous with polar exploration, and whose career spanned decades of pioneering expeditions to the Arctic and Antarctic alike. Byrd was meticulous, disciplined, and careful, known for his methodical approach to planning and execution. A man who measured every statement and acted with deliberate precision. The mission's stated objectives were straightforward: map the Antarctic coastline, establish a research presence, train personnel and equipment for extreme cold weather operations, and gather scientific data that could inform future exploration or military planning. Yet, despite the preparation, the expedition lasted only 8 weeks before being recalled for reasons that were officially attributed to adverse weather conditions, logistical challenges, and the difficulties inherent in sustaining operations in such an unforgiving environment. On its own, these reasons are plausible. The Antarctic environment is unpredictable. Storms can arrive without warning. Ice conditions can trap ships, and equipment designed for temperate climates often fails in sub-zero conditions. But it was Byrd's comments during a press interview in Chile, delivered on the expedition's return, that drew my attention. In that interview, Byrd spoke carefully, deliberately, and almost in passing about a potential threat emerging from the polar regions, describing objects capable of traversing from pole to pole at extraordinary speeds. His choice of words was precise, his tone cautious, and his demeanor consistent with a man accustomed to balancing honesty with discretion. Byrd was not prone to exaggeration. He was a disciplined officer and an experienced explorer who understood the consequences of misstatement. Yet, in those few sentences, he conveyed something that seemed, at least in retrospect, incongruous with the operational objectives of High Jump. There was no explicit reference to hidden bases, secret technology, or supernatural phenomena. There was only a carefully measured acknowledgement that the polar regions could harbor things that the average observer, or even the seasoned military officer, would not fully anticipate. At the time, I filed this statement away, assuming it was simply a reflection of Cold War-era concerns about aerial technology, reconnaissance, or emerging aviation threats. It was an oddity in a body of research that was otherwise concerned with supply chains, ship readiness, and cold weather equipment performance. Weeks later, as I continued to explore Antarctic history for unrelated purposes, I came across the Antarctic Treaty of 1959, again entirely outside the context of Byrd's statement or the specific zones that would later draw my attention. The treaty itself is extraordinary in its context. 12 nations, including bitter Cold War rivals, came together to sign a document that explicitly prohibited military activity, restricted certain categories of exploration, and committed to preserving the continent for peaceful scientific purposes. At first glance, the treaty's provisions make sense. Antarctica is remote, hostile, and costly to access, and cooperation in this theater reduces the risk of conflict while facilitating scientific research. It protects ecosystems, enables shared research, and creates a continent free of weapons development and military escalation. Yet the treaty, while comprehensive in scope, is not uniform in its application. Certain interior regions, far from research stations, ice shelves, or known logistical routes, carry restrictions whose intensity seems disproportionate when measured against their apparent lack of strategic or scientific value. The rules applied to these areas suggest a universal understanding among governments that these zones are special, significant, or sensitive in a way that official documentation does not fully explain. Adding a further layer of intrigue or historical and anthropological records. Across pre-Columbian Andean civilizations, indigenous Pacific Northwest traditions, Norse sagas, and Polynesian navigational oral histories, there exist references to beings of extraordinary size, humanoid figures whose descriptions consistently feature skeletal anomalies, unusual proportions, and exceptional strength. These accounts are treated in most scholarly circles as myth or allegory, yet a pattern emerges when one examines the geographic context of the stories. In multiple traditions, these beings are described as retreating southward, moving into icy, inhospitable regions, often described as the edge of known lands or the terminus of human habitation. Taken individually, each account could be explained as allegorical, symbolic, or culturally coincidental. Taken collectively, however, and especially when mapped against the same coordinates that are restricted and geophysically anomalous in modern datasets, the repetition is difficult to ignore. I was not searching for confirmation of myth or mystery, yet these convergences, Byrd's unusual statement, the Antarctic treaty restrictions, the geometric anomalies observed in satellite imagery, and the consistent southern orientation of mythological accounts demanded careful consideration. Each thread, examined in isolation, might be dismissed. Together, they form a complex pattern that challenges conventional assumptions. These are not merely curiosities or artifacts of human imagination. They are observations that, when connected across independent domains of history, science, and international policy, suggest that Antarctica is more than a continent of ice and research stations. It is a location treated with an almost ritualized seriousness, where access is controlled and where anomalies are quietly acknowledged without explicit explanation. At this point, the question is unavoidable. Why are these specific coordinates treated differently? What exists there that demands decades of coordinated restriction? Not as a matter of conspiracy in the traditional sense, but as a product of institutional caution, scientific prudence, and international self-preservation. The answer, as far as publicly available records allow, remains elusive, but the pattern is clear. Antarctica contains zones that are consistently, rigorously, and independently recognized as sensitive. Multiple governments, scientists, and historical accounts converge on these areas, yet no explanation fully accounts for their treatment. The anomalies are real, the restrictions are real, and the convergence is unmistakable. Whether the explanation is geological, biological, historical, or entirely unknown, the result is a continent whose interior is governed by rules that exceed ordinary environmental or strategic concerns, a landscape where mystery persists in the shadows of ice, treaties, and time. Even as I considered the historical, geopolitical, and mythological threads, the physical data became impossible to ignore. Antarctica is not a uniform sheet of ice. It is a dynamic, layered environment where subglacial lakes, geothermal heat, and ice flows create pockets of liquid water, pressure, and biological possibility that challenge our conventional understanding of extreme environments. One of the most striking examples is Lake Vostok. Hidden beneath nearly 4 kilometers of ice, sealed for between 15 and 34 million years, a body of water that existed long before human civilization and persisted entirely beyond our observation. In 2012, Russian scientists drilling toward its depths made early microbial discoveries that did not match known families of life. The scientific community initially reported the results briefly, then the coverage faded. Contamination concerns were cited as the primary explanation for the quiet, a reasonable argument since drilling into a sealed lake risks introducing foreign microbes and invalidating any finding. Yet, when I compare the response to similar discoveries, such as Martian meteorite biosignatures, which ignited years of public discussion, replication efforts, and scientific debate, the contrast was striking. A lake untouched for tens of millions of years, potentially harboring life entirely unknown to science, received barely a ripple.
I am not implying deliberate cover-up, I am describing a pattern. Subglacial lakes exist across the continent, some known and some only recently discovered via satellite mapping, and the response to findings in these lakes is invariably cautious, quiet, and slow-moving. The Antarctic environment is uniquely sensitive, but the pattern of restraint exceeds what would be expected from ordinary scientific prudence. Scientific institutions are conservative, cautious, and self-regulating, yet the layering of caution, restriction, and limited disclosure forms a structural silence that is indistinguishable in practice from coordinated suppression. Even though no formal conspiracy exists, the silence emerges naturally, spontaneously, because the discovery of life forms that have existed untouched for millions of years, or potentially anomalous features beneath kilometers of ice, poses consequences that no institution is equipped to manage, politically, socially, or culturally. Adding another layer to this is the satellite data, which presents anomalies that are both subtle and profound. NASA's GREAC satellites, which measure gravitational variation, have detected unexpected mass concentrations beneath specific interior sectors of the continent, areas that correlate precisely with several of the zones restricted under treaty law. These anomalies suggest that the density of material beneath the ice is inconsistent with known geological formations, yet the data provides no explicit explanation. The original researchers described them as unexplained mass concentration zones, noting that the subsurface density is higher than surrounding regions, but stop short of hypothesizing what that mass might be. For me, the convergence is undeniable. Restricted zones, unusual geometrical formations in satellite imagery, and mass concentration anomalies overlap in ways that cannot be dismissed as random coincidence. 3 independent datasets, collected for entirely different purposes by scientists and policymakers with no coordination, converge on the same coordinates, demanding careful consideration. When assessing these anomalies, I repeatedly reminded myself of pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist, and I applied rigorous skepticism to every image, every coordinate, and every geophysical irregularity. Most purported anomalies can be explained by low-resolution imagery, optical illusions in ice formations, or ordinary topographical variation. Yet a small fraction resist these explanations, appearing consistently across different imaging passes and datasets. Their alignment with treaty-restricted zones, the very locations that multiple nations have agreed should remain off-limits, is what elevates the anomaly from a curiosity to something that demands inquiry. It is not the size, shape, or dramatic nature of these formations that is striking. It is the precision, the consistency, and the overlap with politically controlled spaces that captures attention. Even with these datasets, I remained grounded. The most extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and I am not here to assert knowledge I do not have. I do not claim the presence of humanoid life beneath Antarctic ice, nor do I claim that any specific discovery is definitive proof of hidden civilizations. What I do observe is convergence, multiple lines of evidence from independent domains pointing at the same regions, combined with historical precedent, institutional caution, and the unusual language of treaties.
The Antarctic Treaty itself contains a series of exceptions and ambiguities. Military activity is prohibited except for scientific support. Exploration is restricted but vaguely defined, and peaceable use is emphasized while permitting exceptions under circular definitions that almost invite interpretation. Vague treaty language is common, but in the case of Antarctica, where initial exploration was incomplete and the environment poorly understood, the vagueness could serve as a mechanism to allow certain activities to continue while maintaining a publicly enforceable prohibition. It is impossible to know definitively if this was intentional, but the alignment between ambiguous exceptions and anomalous zones is compelling. Historical accounts further complicate the picture. Norse sagas describe frost giants driven to the edges of the known world. Polynesian navigational traditions describe southern lands inhabited by beings of immense size. Andean oral histories describe giants retreating into cold southern lands, described geographically in ways that correspond loosely to Antarctica itself. Cultural diffusion is often invoked as an explanation, but when analyzed carefully, the descriptions suggest a geographic specificity and directional consistency that cannot easily be dismissed. These narratives may not prove the presence of anything biological, yet they persist independently across civilizations that had no contact, hinting at an enduring human awareness of distant polar regions. When viewed alongside the physical anomalies and policy restrictions, the myths acquire a new layer of relevance, not as proof, but as part of a larger pattern of observation and interpretation.
The physical possibility of life, particularly subglacial or extremophile life, underscores that what seems impossible at first glance is often plausible within the constraints of science. Lake Vostok and other subglacial lakes demonstrate that liquid water exists beneath kilometers of ice, maintained by geothermal energy and isolated from surface conditions for millions of years. Microbial life thrives there, adapting to darkness, pressure, and extreme cold, suggesting that ecosystems in these regions are robust, persistent, and capable of surprises. The reflexive dismissal of humanoid or large-scale life in Antarctica is therefore not grounded in evidence but in assumptions about surface-level inhospitality. Extremophiles demonstrate that life persists in ways that challenge human expectations, making the reflexive impossible argument less persuasive than it first appears. As the anomalies, historical accounts, and treaty peculiarities converge, a picture emerges that is unsettling precisely because it is incomplete. Multiple independent datasets, the restricted zones, the satellite anomalies, the gravitational irregularities, the subglacial lakes, and the historical and mythological accounts all point to the same coordinates. No single dataset proves anything beyond doubt. No historical account is definitive, yet the accumulation of evidence forms a convergence that is difficult to dismiss entirely. It is not proof of a secret base, hidden civilization, or humanoid presence. It is, however, proof that these zones exist, are treated with extraordinary caution, and intersect with phenomena that are unusual by any standard of polar science or geopolitics. I have spent more than a year examining these threads, not seeking a sensational conclusion, but seeking to understand why certain areas of Antarctica are treated differently. The answer remains elusive. The restricted zones, the anomalies, and the treaty language resist simple explanation. What is clear is that Antarctica is governed by a set of invisible rules, not written in law, but encoded in behavior, practice, and the cautious discretion of scientific and political institutions. The pattern is persistent, layered, and convergent. It's not a matter of speculation alone. It is a matter of documented observation, careful cross-referencing, and rigorous analysis. What lies beneath the ice may never be fully understood, but the edge of knowledge is visible, and the convergence of evidence marks a boundary that is both real and profoundly enigmatic. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, like, comment, and hit the subscribe button.